All right, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the Wharton Esherick Museum Spotlight Talk. So my name is Ethan Snyder, and I'm the museum's manager of collections and public programming. I'm really thrilled to share today's talk with you all that's focused on some of Wharton Esherick's earliest exhibitions that took place in the first few years of the 1920s. I think in some respects, this is going to be a familiar story to a lot of people, but one that goes a little more in depth than we're used to. So naturally, the story of exhibiting Esherick tends to focus on what we'd call his major exhibitions that landed him on a national or international stage, such as the 1940 New York World's Fair, where Esherick exhibited in collaboration with the architect George Howe, or Esherick's solo exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts in 1958. These exhibitions were, without a doubt, really pivotal moments in Esherick's career that helped him to continue garnering public interest in his work. However important these particular exhibitions were, they came after 2 decades of exhibitions and shows that began as early as 1920. So, in today's talk, we're going to be exploring what we can learn about the artist and his work from his earliest exhibitions, and we'll be exploring the question of how they can help us better understand Esherick's major shows. So in today's talk, we're first going to cover a selection of Esherick's exhibitions from the 1920s. Esherick exhibited at a number of museums, galleries, and art clubs, and we'll be focusing on a couple of exhibitions in particular that have some really interesting related information that Letty Esherick actually archived for us in a scrapbook where she pasted exhibition catalogs, newspaper clippings, and the like. And then we'll turn to some of the exhibitions that Esherick actually hosted at his own home at Sunnycrest before we take stock of what these early exhibitions can bring to light in the larger context of Wharton's long career. Ooh, sorry, skipping way ahead here. So before we dive headfirst into Esherick's 1920s exhibitions, it's helpful to provide a little bit of context. So how many shows was this artist exhibiting each year? Where around the country was Esherick showing? And what types of venues showed his work? So, in the years between Esherick's fateful trip to Fairhope, Alabama, that set him on the path towards woodworking and ultimately the creation of his 1926 studio, it appears that Esherick had anywhere between, say, 4 and upwards of half a dozen exhibitions per year. He was mainly showing at places like art galleries and art clubs, with a couple of shows here and there at museums. And here on the right side of the page, we see that there's a listing for both the Brooklyn Museum and the Pennsylvania Museum of Art, or the Pennsylvania Museum of Industrial Art, as it was called then, which is now the PMA. And in 1923, 1924, that was still located in Memorial Hall from the Centennial. So even in these early years, Esherick's work was exhibited as pretty far away places. And in the first year of his exhibitions, we see that he's showing as far away as Newport, Rhode Island, as well as in Ohio for a state fair. So Esherick's first exhibition, which was a show of paintings, took place in 1920 in Fairhope, Alabama. What people saw of Esherick's work for the first few years was mainly a mix of oil paintings, pastels, and watercolors. Most of Esherick's paintings depict landscapes, with some still lives and interior scenes mixed in as well. The paintings that Esherick showed were done in places like Fairhope, Alabama, the Adirondacks, around his home in Chester County, as well as some from his travels in New England, like Boston and Cape Cod. He would exhibit paintings as late as the 1960s, but really stopped showing paintings regularly by 1926 when his studio was built and he had shifted focus mainly towards making prints, sculpture, and furniture. So Esherick appears to have begun exhibiting sculpture slightly earlier than exhibiting prints. In February 1921, he exhibited 2 of his earliest sculptures that were done at the Gardner Doing Dance Camp in the Adirondacks that we see here. These 2 sculptures, Ruth and Doris, were executed in bronze and coated with the same, executed in plaster and coated with the same bronze powder that he used to gilt his hand-carved frames. And while it's not documented in the catalog for the show, it appears that Esherick's first piece of furniture, an antique bench that the artist carved, was shown in February of 1921. The following month, March 1921, Esherick began exhibiting sculpture, like we see here. But it doesn't appear that Esherick would exhibit any prints until early 1922, shortly after which he would largely leave his painting practice behind. So, in Esherick's early exhibition at the Organic School of Education in Fairhope, Alabama, he showed a total of 38 works, including oil paintings, watercolors, pastels, and chalks. No reviews were documented by Wharton or Letty Esherick, but the landscape paintings that comprised the main theme of this show would be a dominant theme for Esherick's painting exhibitions going forward. Luckily, many of these early works were done in Fairhope, were recently conserved by the Conservation Center for Art and uh, the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts under a Save America's Treasures grant, and we'll see some of those briefly. So here and in the following slide, we'll see some of the pastels that Esherick exhibited in Fairhope in 1920, including this one titled Pine Woods, as well as one called The Gully and one of the Fairhope Pier. And here we see this lovely one of the Fairhope Pier, which Esherick also rendered later on as a print, and then this of a gully. So, two particularly interesting exhibitions, and ones that I referenced a little earlier, that took place in 1919, or I'm sorry, in 1921, will be the focus here going forward for a little bit. One was a show at McLee's Gallery in Philadelphia in February, and one at the Babcock Gallery the following month in March. So McLee's Gallery was located at 1507 Walnut Street in Philadelphia, or in the heart of downtown Philadelphia, really. And they hosted Esherick's work for the short span of February 14th to February 26th. And the title of this exhibition is quite a mouthful, but it does give us a sense of Esherick's early practice. So the title of this show was An Exhibition of Paintings, Oils, Pastels, Watercolors by Wharton Harris Esherick, painted in the pines of southern Alabama, in the Adirondack Mountains, on Cape Cod, and in Chester Valley, Pennsylvania. Esherick showed a total of 85 pieces at McLee's Gallery, including 35 watercolors, 33 oil paintings, 11 pastels, 3 pencil sketches, and the plaster sculptures Doris and Ruth. That was a huge show for him, like right off the bat. So while none of Esherick's prints were exhibited, we can see that he executed a small print here that was used for the front of the exhibition catalog. And here we see a couple of examples of the pieces that visitors to McLee's Gallery would have seen. Here we have Dancers in the Moonlight, and on the right we have Doris, and both of them, again, use that same bronze powder that Esherick was using to gilt this early work. And here we see two watercolors that were shown at McLee's Gallery, both of which are from Esherick's time in Alabama and which were recently conserved by CCHA. The one on the left is a pine scrub, and the one on the right is actually one of my personal favorites in our watercolor collection, and it is of a wood yard in Alabama. So the reviews of Esherick's McLee's Gallery exhibition are, to be fair, pretty lukewarm. That's not to say that the Philadelphia Public Ledger's reviewer didn't find anything particularly negative to say about Esherick's paintings, but they also seemed to struggle to find anything particularly positive or find anything new or interesting in this work either. So these reviews of Esherick's paintings are often filled with adjectives like picturesque, quaint, and well handled. And what stands out from McLee's gallery showing, as evidenced by the review that we see on the right side of the screen, is that people started to take note of Esherick's hand carved frames and other early work in 3 dimensions. So the reviewer for the Public Ledger takes the time and space to acknowledge Esherick's frame making practice, noting that, quote, every frame in the exhibition is his work, and this explains the unusually harmonious relation of the frame to the painting within. In addition, the reviewer for the Public Ledger also drew some particular attention toward Esherick as, quote, an uncommonly fine woodcarver. And that's a fact that was exemplified by a carved bench and table that was shown at the gallery. We don't know exactly what table it was, but I'm led to believe that this was that antique carved bench that Esherick could have shown there. It does come a year later, but it's possible that, the date on the bench could be wrong, or that it was an earlier bench that Esherick would have carved. And we know that he had a practice of buying and carving antiques for a couple of years in the early 1920s. But unfortunately for Esherick, in his oral history interview that was conducted by his daughter Ruth Esherick and his son-in-law Bob Bascom towards the end of his life, that is now part of our oral history collection, Wharton recalls, quote, not selling a damn thing. So the exhibition at the Babcock Gallery opened the following month and was up from March 28th through April 9th of 1921. As Esherick described in the same interview that Bob and Ruth conducted, the Babcock Gallery was a kind of pay-to-play model. Esherick was shopping his work around New York galleries, going, quote, gallery to gallery, as he recalled, until he went into Babcock and they offered to give him a show. But it's a little more complicated. So I call it a pay-to-play model because Esherick had to actually rent the space for the duration of the show. And on top of that, the gallery would take a percentage of any sales, which for the second time in a row, none occurred, unfortunately. But in total, Esherick recalled that the exhibition cost him around $3,000. And this included the cost to rent the space, presumably the transportation of all of the work up and back from New York City, as well as the material for the frames that he made to display the 23 paintings on view. The exhibition also included a number of watercolors that Esherick likely made frames for, as well as the plaster sculpture Ruth that we saw previously, and notably the first sculpture in wood, an ebony figure called Muse that we'll see in just a moment. So the introduction to the checklist for this Babcock show at least highlights the frames for Esherick's work, noting that, quote, Mr. Esherick has worked in many mediums, and his enthusiasm for decoration expresses itself in these frames, which he has designed and carved himself. However, just like the review for the Public Ledger, the introduction to the Babcock's checklist kind of also struggles to find anything particularly new or noteworthy about Esherick's paintings. And again, they kind of land on using soft language like quaint, picturesque, and peaceful. So that's not to say that they didn't like Esherick's work, but that it wasn't really pushing the bill like some other work might have been doing at the time. Um, and because, this is a pretty simple introduction to Esherick's work, I would argue that the gallery didn't really feel like they needed to prepare their audience to see anything that they weren't used to seeing already. So that's to say that they probably felt that Esherick's paintings were pretty standard for the time. So alongside the sculpture's Muse that we see here on the left and the plaster sculpture Ruth that we see on the right, visitors to Babcock Gallery would have seen a collection of watercolors, oil paintings, and pastels. And included with the sculptures and with this collection of paintings is this interior scene of the family farmhouse Sunnycrest that is still in the Wharton Esherick Museum collection today. And here we can see the hearth and the living room of their farmhouse. So Letty Esherick clipped and saved a number of reviews from the Babcock Gallery show in one of the scrapbooks that she created, and that's the scrapbook that we're seeing here. It appears that this was the first show that garnered a fair bit of press for Esherick, with a total of 12 clippings related to the exhibition. Arguably the most interesting and significant piece of press to come out of this show for Esherick ran in the New York Evening Sun on May 2nd, 1921. And this piece was written by the critic Mary Segrist, and it was titled Sister or Art is Sister to Labor and Life. And it's a wonderfully prescient meditation on the project that Esherick would undertake for the rest of his life. That is, bridging the gap between art and life. So the piece begins with a short review of Esherick's show at the Babcock Gallery, but then the rest of the article is actually dedicated to direct quotations from Esherick, where he's espousing his own ideas about art and life directly to the reader. So I'm pulling a quote from the article that we see here, and it's as follows. We have need of art everywhere. I want to help it get into the movies, and I want to see it get into more homes. You cannot shut your eyes to this need for art. It's at the foundation of all our life. It's first, not last, in the order of education. Esherick recalls that during the war, and that's the First World War, people set up almost as much of a howl about the cathedrals that were destroyed as they did about the loss of human life. This feeling for beauty is in every human being, no matter how it may have been neglected or set aside by the pressures of life. So while Esherick in this article is largely discussing his views of art education and his time teaching art to both young white and black children in Fairhope, Alabama, we can hear kernels of Esherick's lifelong project being discussed here as early as 1921, 5 years before he would create his 1926 studio, or even start to kind of make woodwork for clients. So, what appears to be the first documented studio open house where Esherick invited the public to see paintings, prints, sculptures, and carved furniture in the place where they were being made took place between May 30th and June 4th in 1922. And here we can see a pamphlet and woodblock print that Esherick made to mark the occasion and send around as an invitation. At Esherick's studio, visitors would have seen a range of media that Esherick worked in, and both things that he made for himself and things that he likely made to sell as well. Because these were not formal exhibitions of kind of a bounded collection of work, there aren't necessarily checklists that went along with the open houses. Rather, I imagine that guests were invited to peruse the grounds, home, and Esherick's studio in the barn more organically and inquire about things as they saw fit. And in his oral history interview, Esherick recalls hosting these early open houses and that it was, quote, mostly my friends that were coming out to me. However, unlike the general gallery-going public, Esherick did find some success selling paintings to friends in these early years for anywhere between $25 and $125. And extant material, such as circulars, such as these, can help us determine that there were at least 4 open houses that took place at the Esherick family farmhouse, happening in the early summertime, such as in May and June, and also around the holiday season. So the reviews published in response to Esherick's open houses are fundamentally different and far more interested than the exhibitions Esherick was putting on in galleries, art clubs, and museums. And the responses are so different, and I think that they're so interesting for how different they are. So the critics that wrote about the open houses and the work that they saw in Esherick's family farmhouse and barn studio, they kind of immediately appeared to understand the ideas that Esherick was espousing in that article in the Evening Sun, namely that art and life should and can go hand in hand. And one reviewer of an open house at Sunnycrest just flat out says, quote, it is easy to understand Esherick's work once seeing the background, suggesting that this work is better understood in the context in which it was made. So one review of an open house even opens proclaiming, and believe me when I say this, quote, The earthly paradise is not altogether fiction. At Esherick's home, people saw the way the family lived, with a seamless transition between art and life. And in this way, the family farmhouse really acted as a kind of proving ground for the ideas about art and life that Esherick would realize not only in his 1926 home and studio, but for many of his clients throughout his career as well. Some critics would find the early studio space perplexing, but it always garnered some interest. And I'm quoting directly here from a review of the first open house. Quote, Wharton Esherick prefers to exhibit his children of hand and brain amid the surroundings in which they were created. It is very odd and very interesting. So even though people were perplexed, you can tell that there is a kernel of interest that is kind of driving the reviews. And reviews of later open houses continue to describe the environment of the Esherick home and Wharton's barn studio at length. And the article that we see clipped here is the one that opens up describing Esherick's home as a kind of Garden of Eden. So, oftentimes, such as in this article, photographs were included as visual illustrations of the work that a writer would be discussing. And in the public ledger, like we see here, they discuss the stone animal sculptures that adorn the yard and the pond, such as the stork and frog, the gardens of peonies that Letty cultivated, the rolling hills around the farmstead, and the many pieces of art that adorned the home. And inside the Esherick family farmhouse and Wharton's barn studio, even Esherick's paintings kind of took on a new life. And they were described much, much more favorably in his workspace and home than they were in any gallery setting before that. And critics coming to Esherick's family farmhouse found it, quote, provides the ideal atmosphere for creative work, and that Esherick had created, quote, a veritable home of art, from the hand-carved tables in the living room to the amusing murals on the nursery wall. And here we see a couple photographs of some of the extant fragments of those murals painted on the nursery room walls. Um, I learned recently from a tenant who lived at the farmhouse after the Esherick family had moved out and who lived in one of the old nursery rooms that these murals kind of made it feel as though the person living inside of that room was the farm animal inside of like a pen, and that the farm animals were outside looking in. So it's a kind of interesting and very comical reversal, very classic Esherick. So what can we learn or what can these early exhibitions teach us about those major exhibitions that happened later on? So, for starters, the two major exhibitions that we cover most often, the 1940 New York World's Fair and the 1958 Solo Show at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts, brought a number of media together that I would argue would be the requisite ingredients for a life lived with art. So, in the Pennsylvania Hill House room at the New York World's Fair, for example, visitors saw not only Esherick's furniture, but pieces of interior architecture represented in his staircase, as well as other forms of craft, such as textiles, ceramics, and even an ivory spoon made by Esherick's German friend, Hannah Weil, who we heard about in our previous Spotlight talk. And here in the image on the right side of the screen, we can see that the New York World's Fair really brings together a total artist environment from the staircase to the wall to the ceramics that are on the table and behind the sofa. Um, and we see a similar kind of exhibition design here for the Museum of Contemporary Crafts in 1958 that also kind of brought together what I would call a healthy mix of materials that represented a more comprehensive view of a domestic interior, inclusive of prints on the wall, sculpture, furniture, interior architecture like the staircase, and built-in shelving, along with those smaller household goods that Esherick was making, such as bowls, trays, platters, serving forks, spoons, and even something as small as a letter holder. So just like we consider Esherick's 1926 studio to be a total work of art, from the building itself down to the individual switch plates for lights and the sculptural door handles and locks, It appears that this exhibition in 1958 attempted to kind of recreate this type of total artistic environment. And here on the left side of the screen, I think it's really interesting that we see the inclusion of a houseplant and a kind of sheer curtain, as though the exhibition design is suggesting what these pieces would look like inside of a domestic interior. And to even further make these ties between the exhibition design and the domestic interior, the Museum of Contemporary Crafts catalog included a number of staged photos of Esherick's home, some of which were taken for the House Beautiful magazine earlier in the decade, and other images of interiors that Esherick created for clients, such as the Curtis Bach home. Mm. So, using Esherick's own artist environment as a guiding principle for exhibiting and displaying his work has continued to inform curatorial choices that we make today. So, if you've had an opportunity to see the crafted world of Wharton Esherick at the end of last year at the Brandywine Museum of Art or at the Chazen Museum in Madison, Wisconsin, since the year opened up, you'll have had, or you will have noticed that the exhibition kind of runs the gamut of Esherick's creative output, from the inclusion of paintings and prints to furniture and sculpture to the charming household objects like we see here on the right, with the cutting board wall that's made of cutting boards, bowls, trays, and salad serving utensils. And in addition, the crafted World of Wharton Esherick show was kind of designed to recreate those moments of discovery that visitors to the studio experience on a daily basis. So, in the galleries at the Brandywine and the Chazen, as visitors walk around the modular walls and peek through window cutouts, new vistas and perspectives open up, new details come into focus, and you're seeing the work anew each time. And I think that we'd all agree, as people who appreciate Wharton Esherick's work, that an individual piece of his work, whether it be a sculpture, a print, a painting, a piece of furniture, can without a doubt speak for itself. And whether or not early critics and reviewers of his work could glean this for themselves when they saw his paintings, for example, in Macleish Gallery or the Babcock, or somewhere like the Brooklyn Museum, they did take notice of some relational quality of Esherick's work in that his paintings and frames became increasingly, or the connection between them became increasingly important. But as his practice grew into three dimensions and he started to make new types of pieces, these kind of relational connections all became so much more important, um, to the point that we eventually see these exhibitions that kind of mirror the full interiors, and the full range of work that Esherick was making. So I think that it's really interesting that we can see the kind of maybe failures of these early exhibitions in the 1920s, solely focused on painting, then informing exhibitions even up to today as we try to exhibit as many different types of materials together as possible. So that's about all I have for today. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open this up for questions.